Welcome to Crimes Across Borders. My name is Cora and this video is part 2. So if you're new here, you might want to watch part 1 first. It will probably make more sense. Link is in the description below. And of course, please subscribe if you don't want to miss future videos. In part 1, we looked at some of the biggest voices who questioned the McCann story, from detectives to profilers to YouTubers, but theories about this case don't stop there. In this part, we are diving into the side stories, the myths and the forensic oddities that have fueled speculations for almost 20 years. From the so-called fridge theory to why police never found Madeleine's DNA in the apartment to questions about a washed toy. One of the most persistent theories around this case is what people call the fridge theory. The idea is simple but chilling, that Madeleine's body was hidden in a fridge or freezer before being moved somewhere else. This theory didn't come out of nowhere. Early in the investigation, the Portuguese police actually searched fridges and freezers in and around Praia da Luz. They didn't find anything, but the fact that they even looked was enough to get people speculating. And later, when David Payne gave his rogatory interview in England, he mentioned problems with the fridge in one of the apartments. He didn't expand on it, but once again, he gave fuel to the fire. And then there was the internet rumor that Gary McCann himself once wrote on his blog about replacing or removing a fridge in one of the rental flats. And that post was later deleted. And no one has ever produced a verified copy of that entry, but it's been repeated so many times online that for many people it feels like a fact now. Put those three things together, police checking fridges, Payne's vague comment, and the blog rumor, and you can see why this theory stuck. For some, it's a proof that something sinister was covered up, and for others is just a good example of how little fragments of information can grow into a full-blown conspiracy theory. So I do need to add here that there's no actual evidence for it. No DNA was ever found in a fridge. No cadaver dog ever alerted on one. And the replacement fridge story has never been confirmed. Officially, it remains a speculation. But the fridge wasn't the only place people speculated about. Over the years, another theory popped up that Madeleine may have been hidden much closer to the center of town in the local church. In 2012, Portuguese police conducted discreet searches of the Our Lady of the Light church, including its cemetery and the grounds, under a theory that a coffin in the church could have concealed Madeleine's body beneath the remains of an older British woman. Some reports say the McCanns were given keys by the local priests and that the priests were later questioned about their access. Former lead investigator Gonzalo Amaral has also floated this possibility. He claimed there was information that 3 figures entered the church late at night carrying a bag, and that the body may have been placed under an existing coffin. But Amaral called it a hypothesis, not something officially confirmed by the PJ, despite the fact that they did conduct those searches. The fridge and the church theory isn't the only side story tied to this case. Over the years, Madeleine's disappearance has attracted all sorts of speculation, some based on scraps from the investigation and some coming straight from internet forums. One of the most notorious is the idea of secret societies, sometimes called the Red Club. According to this theory, powerful people were involved in covering up what really happened. You will hear whispers about the Illuminati, shadow networks, even claims that world leaders protected the McCanns. Now, none of this ever been backed up by evidence. It's internet talk, not something coming from the police files. But let's be real. The McCanns were wealthy, well-connected, and media coverage they got was immediate and huge, unlike almost any other missing child case, especially in the UK. Add the fact that other influential people were staying at the resort. No surprise people jumped on it. If you've been on TikTok, you've probably seen those videos with eerie music and photos of men all wearing red shoes. It's technically already been disproven that Gary McCann was one of them, but people won't let it go and it spreads like wildfire. Honestly, as I said before, it's not hard to see why. There's a missing child, high-profile parents, global headlines. It's like fuel for this type of conspiracy thinking. And in this case, we also have these messy investigations and all the contradictions. There's really no surprise people reach for big, dramatic explanations. And TikTok really has become a hotspot for the McCann theories. Every few months, a clip goes viral claiming Madeleine has been found alive, sometimes in Germany, sometimes elsewhere. There were few young women claiming they were Madeleine. Every time the story falls apart, but then the cycle repeats. And those videos rack up millions of views. I mean, conspiracies are entertaining as hell. And once a case gets this famous, people will keep stacking new stories on top of it. Sometimes those stories travel further online than the actual evidence ever does. Especially that there's not a lot of actual evidence in this case. We've talked about conspiracy theories and the wild speculations, but some of the strangest details in this case don't come from TikTok or forums at all. They come from the investigation itself. Real things written in the files that just don't sit right. So let's start with DNA, or more accurately, the lack of it. Samples were taken from the apartment and later from the hire car the McCanns rented weeks after Madeleine disappeared. When those samples got to the UK lab, many of them came back as inconclusive. Too mixed, too degraded, too complex to pin down. In other words, nothing that could stand up in court. For a lot of people, that's shocking. Because how do you fail to find clear DNA from a child in a flat that were supposedly slept all week? It could be just a forensic failure, sure, considering that it was reported they weren't even wearing gloves while touching the windows and taking the evidence from the flat. But I don't know, it is a bit strange if you ask me. Now, linked to that is another story you will hear online that police wanted a controlled DNA sample, like a toothbrush or a hairbrush from Madeleine, but they couldn't get one. Some people even claim McCann said the children shared the toothbrush, which made it useless for identification. I'll be honest, I couldn't find any official document confirming that part. It's repeated in blogs and forums and in Hall's videos, but not in the PJ files or any trustworthy articles that would quote their sources. I also find it hard to believe that a couple of doctors would use one toothbrush for all their kids. But then I also find it hard to believe that they would leave 3 children under 3 alone in an apartment for the night. But yeah. And then there's the Madeleine's toy cuddle cat. I'm not sure what is more suspicious, the fact that the police didn't take it into evidence. It was seen on the bed, the last place Madeleine was technically seen alive, or the fact that Kate McCann admitted to washing it after Madeleine vanished. Her explanation was that it had been handled by too many people and it got dirty. But, of course, washing it also meant any trace of evidence was gone forever. And honestly, that's another detail I just can't wrap my head around. Your child disappears and the first thought is to wash her toy. And then the elephant in the room, the children being left alone. Every night, the group went to dinner while the kids, 3 under the age of 4 in the McCann's case, were left in an unlocked apartment. Kate has since said they didn't use the resort babysitting or nanny service, even though it was available. Whether or not it was included for free, I'm not sure, but it was there and they still chose not to use it. Personally, I can't understand that decision. They had a standing reservation for that dinner, so it wasn't like a spur of the moment thing. And I don't know, but wouldn't it be more relaxing drinking wine, enjoying your free time, knowing the kids are safe and not having to run around checking on them constantly? These were educated, wealthy people. They had the means and they had access to services, but they still decided not to use them. Not even a nanny cam. Even if nothing had happened, that is still raising a major red flag for all of those parents. And that brings us to another big question people still ask: why were the McCanns never prosecuted for neglect? In the UK, leaving children that young alone can lead to charges, even though there isn't a strict law that says this age is illegal. In Portugal, things work a bit differently, but their penal code allows charges if a parent puts a child at risk. But in this case, prosecutors decided there wasn't enough to pursue. The fact that the McCanns were doctors, middle class, and very high profile has made critics say they were treated differently. If it had been another family with less money and less influence, would the outcome have been the same? It's one of those questions that still divides the opinion. Some people think that they already lost a child and this is the worst punishment you can ever receive. Tell me what you guys think, if that was enough or if they still should be charged with neglect. Another issue that still raises eyebrows in this case is the reenactment that never happened. In 2008, about a year after Madeleine disappeared, Portuguese investigators wanted the McCanns and their friends, the Tapas 7, to return to Playa da Luz. The idea was simple. Go through the evening of May and do everything step by step so police could clear up contradictions in everyone's statements. That's it. And as you can probably guess, the McCanns and all their friends refused. Through their lawyers, they argued that the reenactment would serve no useful purpose and could even be used against them unfairly. For Portuguese police, though, this was a huge deal. They already struggled with the inconsistent timelines, like who checked on which child, when, for how long. A full reenactment could have settled at least some of those questions. And without it, those contradictions stayed on paper unresolved. Again, this is another one of those points where people split completely. Tell me what you would do, but basically the supporters of the McCanns say, of course they refused. Why cooperate with a police force they felt was targeting them instead of chasing a kidnapper? And then critics say, if your child is really missing, wouldn't you do anything you could to help the investigation, even if it's uncomfortable? In the end, without the cooperation of the parents and the friends, the reenactment was scrapped. And that left one more gap in an investigation already full of missing pieces. So one of the biggest reasons police wanted that reenactment was to clear up contradictions in the timeline. And I guess possibly one of the most famous of those is what's known as the Tanner sighting. Jane Tanner, one of the Tapas 7, told investigators that around 9:15, she walked past the McCann's apartment and saw a man carrying a small child. She described him as holding the child in his arms, dressed in light-colored pajamas, which sounded very much like what Madeleine had been wearing that night. For years, this was treated as the likely abduction moment. But here's where it gets odd. At the same time, in the same narrow street, Gary McCann says he was outside chatting with another holidaymaker, Jeremy Wilkins, just a few yards away, and yet neither Jerry nor Jeremy remembered seeing Jane walk past. And Jane didn't recall seeing them either. 3 adults all supposedly in the same spot at the same time, but their stories don't line up. Maybe that's just memory under stress, or maybe it's something more. What do you think? Could all 3 really have missed each other? Years later, Scotland Yard cast even more doubt on Tanner's account. They suggested she might not have seen a kidnapper at all, but simply another tourist carrying his child home from the crash, which would mean this abduction sighting was never about Madeleine in the first place. And then there's the Smith sighting. Around 10 p.m., an Irish family returning from a night out said they saw a man carrying a young child in Playa da Luz. What stood out was the way the child was held, limp, head on the shoulder, like she was asleep. Later, when the case was all over the media, Martin Smith said that the man's appearance and walk reminded him of Gary McCann. He didn't include that in his initial statement. He only realized a little bit later when he seen a photo of Gary stepping out of the plane and carrying one of the twins in his arms. But here's the thing, the Smith sighting never got the same attention as Tanner's. It wasn't built into official timelines, it wasn't pushed in media appeals. Obviously, supporters say that's because it wasn't considered reliable. Critics say it was ignored because it didn't fit the abduction narrative and it was putting Gary in a bad light. And that's the problem with this case in general. Some details get spotlighted, others get brushed aside, which makes you wonder how different would the investigation have looked if the Smith sighting had been taken as seriously as the Tanner one. And since we are talking about the media, another part of this story that gets people talking is how the McCanns managed the media and the investigation. Right from the beginning, they had access to something most families of missing children never do: a professional PR machine. Clarence Mitchell, a former government press officer, became their official spokesperson. His job was to manage headlines, correct narratives, and keep the story in the public eye. Now, you could argue that's exactly what anyone would do if they had the resources, use every tool possible to keep Madeleine's face on the front page. But critics say it gave the McCanns unusual influence, shaping which leads were amplified and which quietly faded into the background. And that ties directly to what came next, the Operation Grange. If you're not from the UK, maybe you haven't heard of it, but in 2011, 4 years after Madeleine disappeared, the British government ordered the Metropolitan Police to review the case, and this became Operation Grange. At its peak, more than 30 officers were working on it, making it one of the most expensive missing person investigation in British history. By 2019, the cost had already passed £11 million, and more funding has been approved since. What's striking is that Madeleine's case was never officially classed as a UK police investigation. She went missing in Portugal, so technically it was under Portuguese jurisdiction. For other missing British children abroad, UK police usually they might provide some support, but nothing on this scale. So you may ask why Madeleine's case get so many resources when other cases don't. Some people say it's obvious. It was uniquely high-profile disappearance with global attention, and the UK had to step in. Others point to this as a proof of preferential treatment, wealthy parents with government connections getting a response ordinary families could only dream of. Anyway, after years of review, Operation Grange hasn't produced a breakthrough. Leads have been chased and dropped, suspects named and cleared, but Madeleine's fate remains unknown. Which leaves us with the uncomfortable question. Was this an extraordinary effort to find the truth or an expensive exercise designed to support one version of events? Then there's another detail that often gets picked apart, and it has to do with something as ordinary as bed. When police asked Gary McCann to describe the night Madeleine went missing, he talked about how the children were sleeping. At first, he said the bedroom door was left slightly open, and then when they checked on them, everything seemed normal. But over time, details shifted, especially about Madeleine's bed. In one version, Gary described her as being tucked in neatly, the way you would expect if she had been fast asleep. But in later accounts, there were small differences about the exact position of the covers and pillows. Even Kate in her book gives an account that doesn't quite line up with Gary's earlier statements. Again, it could be just a normal memory distortion. People under trauma can mix up details. I spoke about it already. Memory isn't a perfect recording, but critics argued that these kind of contradictions point to staging, that the parents were struggling to keep their story consistent. And here's why this mattered to investigators. The state of the bed was physical evidence. If Madeleine had really been abducted while sleeping, the way the bed looked should have been a crucial detail. Instead, the records show slight contradictions, which obviously, again, fueled suspicion that things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. It might sound like a small thing, a pillow out of place, a blanket moved, but in a case where there was no clear evidence of abduction, even these tiny, tiny details carried weight. And once again, it leaves us in the same frustrating place. Are we seeing normal human error in recalling a traumatic night, or signs of carefully managed story that slipped in the details? Personally, I can't help but feel torn. On one hand, maybe this is a tragic disappearance that will never be solved. On the other, the sheer number of oddities, contradictions, and unfinished leads makes it hard not to wonder if the full truth has ever come out. Well, actually, no. I feel like the full truth for sure didn't come out. I'm just not sure where my mind is at on the extent of it. And that's the question I want to leave with you. After everything we've gone through in part 1 and part 2, what's your gut feeling? Accident, covered up, abduction gone wrong, or something else entirely? Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of the case. And if you did, let me know by liking and commenting this video. Take care.